From the New Arts and Media Studios in Milwaukee, I'm Charles Purcell. This is The Log. Although it's not really The Log today, it's a special little project I've got going. Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. Let me explain. I woke up this morning with an idea. And in my experience, every great idea I've ever had, well, I've never had a great idea. Every good idea I've ever had that worked out, I just woke up with one day. That's not to say that every idea I just wake up with turns out to be a great idea. No, there are plenty that don't work out. But of those ideas that have worked out, they are the wake up with it variety. Get it? Okay. So I woke up with an idea this morning. I've been thinking for years about writing a memoir. I don't have any grand illusions that my life is so special or that anybody would care to read it. Mostly, it's for my own sort of self-examination, self-awareness. And mostly more than that, it's for my two kids. I have a daughter and a son who I mention occasionally here on the program. My mother did it. My mother wrote a memoir for that very purpose, just a very simple family history with some personal reflections, and she did it for her children. And I really appreciated that. I thought that was a wonderful gift. So I've often thought, all right, I should write a memoir. Up till now, I haven't been able to bring myself to do it. For one thing, writing is something that I do and I detest. Well, that's not true. It's just too hard. Writing. If writing is easy for you, congratulations. For me, writing is the single most arduous undertaking I can imagine. So, the idea that I woke up with this morning. I'm going to extemporaneously write my memoir. And today, let's consider this the pilot episode. And if it works out, it'll continue into a series. If it doesn't work out, well, okay, fine, it didn't work out. The idea that I woke up with, just about fully formed, included the idea that this would be part memoir, part history of the United States for the last 60-plus years. I'm 63 as we speak. So part memoir, part U.S. history, at least what I know about it, what I remember, and part treatise, because there's no way that I'm going to be able to talk about these things without sharing my deeply considered opinions about how the world ought to work. Maybe that should be the title when it's all said and done, How the World Ought to Work. I'll bet somebody's already used that title, though. I'll have to Google that up and see. So, part history, part memoir, and part treatise. And today is the pilot episode. All right. Okay. Where do we start? Well, we have to start with Mom and Dad, right? 1958 was the big year that I was born, on my dad's birthday, by the way, which I always took as a great badge of honor. I was so proud of that. I felt so lucky and privileged that I got to share a birthday with my dad. March 12, Pisces. It also, gave me a little bit of a connection to him that otherwise I might not have had. He was that 50s, 60s dad who a lot of people in my generation will tell you, not around a lot, just kind of working all the time, not really available emotionally. So to have that shared birthday was really special to me. It gave us a connection. And it made me think, oh, maybe I understand him a little better than others do, especially when he'd cry. He was a big crier. He would cry at weddings and such. I remember one particular time when my parents met me backstage after a production of Godspell that I'd just been in. And he was crying. I thought, and he didn't really say much. He was very quiet. I don't remember him telling me that he was moved by the performance or that he was proud of me. I don't remember any words. I'm not even sure he spoke any words. But I saw him wiping away a couple of tears, and that was a pretty big deal for me. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with Mom and Dad. That's what you do in a memoir, right? By the way, what's the difference between a memoir and an autobiography? I'm such a dolt when it comes to some things. I think I just answered my own question, though. I think the memoir includes more of the history and treatise elements that I spoke of, where a biography is more the facts. I should say, by way of introduction, I'm not going to tell you everything. This is not going to be a tell-all by any means. No. Some things are going to stay private. I'm going to remember what I remember, and much of it will be misremembered. It'll be outright wrong, maybe. Certainly incomplete as far as the story goes. What I can promise you is that I won't make anything up. I won't embellish. Maybe I shouldn't make that promise. No, I'll promise I won't lie to you. I may omit several things. There may be lies of omission. Okay, I confess that right out of the gate. But I won't lie to you. Here's what I remember about Mom and Dad. Their parents, all four of my grandparents, were immigrants. My dad's parents coming from Ireland, I want to say. I know the heritage is Scottish and Irish. Or, as the Orange Menace would say, Scotch. I remember in an interview he was claiming how much he loved Scotland and what a great connection he had to Scotland. That his mother was Scottish. That his mother, no, the way he said it, my mother was Scotch. And I'm Scotch. What an idiot. Anyway. So Scots-Irish on my dad's side. And then my mother, her parents were both Swedish. So that makes me 1/4 Irish, 1/4 Scottish, and 1/2 Swedish. My little joke has always been that my Swedish timidity tamps down my Irish temper, for whatever that's worth. I definitely have both. At least I used to have quite a temper. I don't anymore. When I was young, I had a big old temper. But I've also always had a little bit of shyness and timidity. So, if that means anything, if national heritage actually means anything, that's the case there. My dad grew up on a farm, and he never shared stories with me. He never said more than a couple words to me. I mean, I don't want to make this sound all melodramatic, but I really did not have a relationship with my dad. So he didn't share stories. I don't really know much about him except what my mother told me. It's like my dad is Socrates and my mother was Plato. She did all the all we know about Socrates comes from Plato, and all I know about my dad comes from my mother. So according to my mother, he was born on a farm and had kind of a severe childhood. His parents were strict, and he worked on the farm from a very early age. And he had a work ethic, man. That's just what he did. It was all about work. It was all about duty to do that work. And that sort of defined his life. On an earlier podcast, I think it was the one I did with Dunzo. It was about an hour with Dunzo and Purcell. I talked a little bit about my dad, and I remember saying something about how duty was very central to his character. He got married and had a bunch of kids, and it was all about work, and it was all about providing, and it was all about duty. This was what defined a man. And in the context of this conversation, I was saying how I promised myself I wouldn't fall into that trap, that I wouldn't limit myself that way, that I wouldn't see life so harshly, so dismally. And as I said, this particular endeavor here, this memoir I'm dictating, is for my son and my daughter. Well, I'm going to mention my son here for a second. He happened to hear that podcast, and he mentioned it to me when we were having our lowest moment. We were having a bit of a fight about the kind of parent I was and maybe the things I didn't understand about him. And he threw that back in my face. He was not happy about that little passage of the podcast, about how duty was not important enough for me, that I should have had more sense of duty toward my kids. I should have sacrificed more. And he made a pretty good case. Now I'm getting ahead of myself, and I'm probably going to do this. There's no getting around it. I'm probably going to jump back and forth historically. But a great turning point in my life was when my dad died when I was 19 years old. And I promised myself that I wouldn't live the same way my dad did, and I certainly wasn't going to die the same way he did. By the way, he died at 63 years old. I just turned 63 a couple of weeks ago, so coincidence, irony, I don't know. So in this sort of dramatic moment that my son and I are having together, you can't really call it a fight. Maybe you can. I don't know. We were being very direct with each other about our feelings. He indicated that he wasn't real happy, that I didn't have a stronger sense of duty like my father had. And my defense was that my father appeared to be generally kind of miserable, and that he and I had no relationship. So my defense was, no, it's not just about work. It's not just about providing. It's about being there. It's about having a relationship with my son. And if I screwed up, I probably did. I don't want to diminish the mistakes I may have made. But anyway, that was my defense. That even though I loved my kids to the moon, and I loved their mom to the moon, I wasn't going to sacrifice myself the way my dad did. I didn't think that was good for me. I didn't think that was good for my kids. I didn't think it was good for their mom. So that's the way I saw it. And I'm not defending it here in this moment. I think my son probably made a pretty good point when he called me out on that. I think I had a couple things to say that maybe he hadn't considered. And the gods, whatever they are, can make the judgment. I can tell you I learned from that conversation, but I've got no hard and fast conclusions. So that was my dad before I came along. A rather severe childhood, defined mostly by working on the farm. And then he joined the military, drove a truck in Kansas through World War II. That's how he contributed to the effort. Tomahawk is where we'd go visit my grandparents. I think that's where he was born. Yeah, northern Wisconsin. I didn't do a lot of research. I just opened up the mic and started talking here. And then while he was in the military, at some point, and I don't know the whole story here, my oldest sister would be the one to go to here. He married his first wife. Oh my goodness, I've forgotten her name. I'm sorry. Well, maybe I'll pick up on this on a later episode. He married his first wife, and they had 2 little girls. And while the little girls were very little girls, Mary and Debbie, of course, my dad was Catholic, so the first daughter is always Mary. That's my oldest sister. Well, sadly, his first wife died. She was First Nations. She was a Native American. And my sister Mary, that's important to her, and that she takes a lot of pride in that, and she's researched her heritage. And shortly after, while Mary and Debbie were still very young, my mother's cousin set her up on a date with this guy Jack she knew. So here's the part of the story I really know nothing about, but obviously they got married. I don't know if they really fell in love. I know nothing about the relationship. All I know is that it was a set-up date from the cousin, and next I know in the family history, they're married. And now my mother has 2 small little girls before having any of her own, obviously. They're living with my dad's parents. And again, this is all coming from my mother. So it's strictly her point of view. And it was just a nightmare, I guess. The old classic mother-in-law problem. Didn't like her, treated her and the children harshly. As soon as they got married, it's like, okay, ring on the finger and then back to the army to drive trucks. So here, my mother is alone with her in-laws and 2 babies. And none of them are hers. It's not her family. It's Jack's family. It's her new husband's family. So, as my mother told it, not happy years, not happy years. So let me go back for a second and give you my mother's background. Prentice, Wisconsin, and her father and brothers all worked as lumberjacks. I mean, this is right out of the storybooks here. So she told of a very romantic childhood where she looked up to her big brothers, and they were all so strong and handsome, and they climbed trees and they worked the lumber yards. And she just had all these wonderful stories, kind of a Walton's Mountain kind of a childhood. She went into nursing, so she was a nurse for a while. She worked for, I forget the name of the doctor. She mentioned him several times. She worshiped her father and told me stories of his adventures, not only in the lumber yards, but he went on to, he ran for sheriff of Prentice County and served as sheriff for a while. He bought a tavern and was the local sort of innkeeper. And according to her, anyway, a big, strapping, popular fella, especially when he was tending bar and everybody would swap stories, talk politics. That's what really got my attention. When she told me that Fighting Bob La Follette would come to my grandpa's tavern and shoot the breeze with the boys whenever he was in the area. Of course, Fighting Bob represented Wisconsin in Congress and was governor for a while. And then his son, young Bob, took up the mantle and also frequented Dad's establishment. So I don't know how much of this is true, but it sure was exciting for me to hear this as a young man with an early interest in politics from age at least 10 when I delivered the Janesville Gazette. And my older brother, was serving in Vietnam. I was very aware and very interested in the news of the day and in politics. And I was already starting to cut my liberal teeth, my progressive teeth, and to know that Fighting Bob La Follette was a buddy of my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, the great early founding progressive Fighting Bob La Follette, ran for president on the progressive ticket. Oh, that was exciting for me. I loved hearing those stories as a kid. So my mother had this sort of idyllic, romanticized childhood, and that's what she shared. Who knows how much of it is true, or how accurate her perception was, or her telling of the story. Who knows? But that's what I learned. And then she goes into nursing, works for a little while, meets my dad, becomes a mother. And from there, a whole bunch of kids. I'm the second to last. They move around a little bit, wind up in Milwaukee. My dad winds up running a little grocery store. In fact, it's just about a mile from where I stand right now. A little spot on the corner, a little grocery store. It's now Wade's Guitar Shop, which I frequent. Wade's Guitar Shop is where I go. I've bought guitars from them. I go there for repairs. I go there for tune-ups and accessories. And every time I go in and hear that little bell over the door, I see my dad's old grocery store with a little meat counter in the back. He was a meat and grocery man, what he turned out to be. Yep, over on Oakland Avenue, just south of Capitol, a couple of blocks. Wade's Guitar Shop used to be a little corner grocery with my dad as proprietor, and they lived over the store, and they had a few young kids, and then as the family grew, they moved a couple of times, wound up in a little town called Lyons, Wisconsin. That's where I was born. The seventh of 8 children, or the 8th of 9 children? I always forget exactly. Let's see, let's count them down. There's Mary and Debbie, the first 2 girls. And then my mom's children, Jackie, John, Christine. That's 5 so far. Then it's James, we called him Jimmy. Then Margaret, who was known as Peggy, but died as a baby. Just about a year old, just a couple of weeks short of her first birthday. She died. And in their grief, the doctor's big recommendation was, go home, have another baby. Here again, all this information comes from my mother. This is my prescription. Have another baby. So they went home and they had me, and I was born 9 months later. So let's see, I lost track. Is that 9? Am I 9? I'm going to go back again here. Mary, Debbie, Jackie, John, Chris, James, Peggy. Oh, Peggy's 7. I'm number 8. And then my younger sister, Michelle, is 9. 9 kids. So that brings us to 1958. And now I enter the story. I come into a world that's defined in history. Boy, you think 1958, you get a pretty clear picture, don't you? Dwight Eisenhower, doo-wop music on the radio, early rock and roll. We got Chuck Berry happening. We got Little Richard on one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is Hey Nani Ding Dong, a lang a lang a lang, boom ba-do, ba-do ba-do hey, stuff like that. We got your sort of Happy Days motif going on, Howdy Doody and all of that. So that's the world I'm born into. I'm born into a black and white world. And my parents were older parents. My mother was, if I do the math right, I think she was 41 when I was born. And she already had a house full of kids. My father was a couple years older, 43 probably when I was born. So very established. Again, my dad just working night and day to support this family, to live up to his duties. A world that was very established. I mean, there may have been no other time in history when conformity was so central to a culture. I only learned later, much, much later, in my 20s, and began to appreciate the Beat generation, of which I felt a great kinship. That was happening in the late 50s, but nobody in Lyons, Wisconsin was aware of it. And most importantly, the fact that I was the second youngest of a large family and that I had older parents relatively meant that their formative years go all the way back to the 20s and the 30s. Forgive me if I get the dates wrong. I think my mother was born in 1919 and my dad in 1917. I think I've got that right. So they were 10 and 12 years old at the time of the crash and into the Great Depression. They were teenagers through the Great Depression, young adults in World War II, and come out of World War II and start having babies. So all of this influence is just inbred into my family, into the household. The ideals, the mores, the music. My mother's music collection. She played piano and had a little bit of a record collection. So there was sheet music in the house. There are records in the house. And so that meant I was born into a world that spanned, culturally, America from the 1920s up to rock and roll and Sputnik. Now, I'm not claiming that this is unique. Everybody's family history spans time. But those of us who have older parents, thinking of a friend of mine who shares this experience. Her parents were much, much older, especially her dad. And so the span of history, the span of influence that permeates the home is more expansive. It goes deeper. It goes further. And having had all these years now to reflect on that, I think it was pretty important to me and my siblings, to my particular view of the world, that when I was brought home from the hospital on my dad's birthday, I was brought into a home that had music and culture and art and furniture and attitudes that were heavily influenced by much, much earlier days, all the way back to the teens and 20s. So let's end it there. You've been listening to a special episode of The Log, which is actually the pilot episode of a potential new series. I don't know if it's going to happen or not. If it does, this memoir/history/treatise will continue as a series. And I may do one or two more as an episode of The Log and share it with you, depending on how things go. If it goes well and I decide to continue this, it will become its own separate podcast series. And of course, I'll let you know where that is and invite you to join me. All right. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm not sure if I did or not. I'm going to listen back and see if I did. I love you. I'm Charles Purcell.